Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Humanities Festival in the Wien Museum. If you wonder why you have these funny paintings on the wall, there's an excellent graffiti exhibition all over the museum, also in the first floor. So I recommend that after the talk you spend some time going upstairs and look at this, look at the examples of graffiti from Vienna walls and other places. It's also the last exhibition, as far as I know, before the museum closes for quite a while because of a major reconstruction renovation effort. But before you do that, please stay and listen to me, Eric Frey, from the Vienna newspaper Der Standard, and in particularly Ivan Krastev, political scientist from Bulgaria, for the Center of Liberal Strategies in Sofia, and also a fellow with the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and one of East Central Europe's, but probably Europe's leading public intellectuals, writes regularly also in the New York Times, and is a voice to be heard all over Europe, all over the world, and today here, which I'm very glad about. Ivan, your last book was called After Europe. It was quite a pessimistic view on the future of the European project, but not without any hope. Your upcoming book, the title is The Light That Failed, seems to be even more pessimistic and somewhat hopeless. It is about the outcome of the revolution and transformation process in East Central Europe, a region where you also come from, which is your home. And the way I understand this, your main argument in this book is that the revolutions of 1989, which were so celebrated here, this was not a revolution of innovation, but a revolution of imitation. And reading some of your pages, it reminded me of what happened in East Central Europe since 1989 is a little bit like the scene in the movie The Jungle Book about Mowgli, when he is captured by the Monkey King, King Louis, who sings, "I wanna be like you." So this is kind of the theme of what happened in East Central Europe, a whole region which tried to become like the West. Why did this project of imitation lead to such disappointing results?
Let's start. First, the book is going to be out in 20 days, so I just have one copy to show that it exists. Secondly, listen, on this pessimism, optimism, I never understood this. Probably this is my Bulgarian nature. First of all, I don't believe that people should be forced to be optimists or pessimists. It's much more a book which is trying to explain certain cycle which ended this 30 years of after 1989, and I was trying to understand basically why certain expectations that we have in 1989 we are seeing in a different way. And there is I have a good quote by Bruce Springsteen, who had this in his song, The River. He had this following line. He said, if a dream it doesn't come true, is it a lie or something worse? And this interesting story is the following. What I was trying to do is, we all talk about the rise of populist governments in Central and Eastern Europe, and the book is not only about Central and Eastern Europe. The book is trying basically, and it is 4 chapters, doing with 4 kind of a different stories of the last 30 years, and what we basically with Stephen Holmes, because this is a book which I did with an American colleague of mine, is trying to answer why liberalism that was perceived as so victorious in 1989, in a certain way lost itself in its victory. And the story goes like this. If you go back to 1989, you're going to see that the expectation was that because of the end of communism, because of the lack of ideological alternatives, what Frank Fukuyama called the end of history, the future of the world is going to look like a version of George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion drama, in which you have this professor in phonetics, which very quickly is going to teach a poor flower girl how to speak like a society lady. By the way, the first staging of the play was here in Vienna. It was not in London. And the funny story was, it was very popular and very successful play, but people wanted at the end of the play the professor to marry the girl. And then Bernard Shaw went ballistic, and he said she'll never do it, because it was about her emancipation. She'll never marry the professor. So my story is that now when you go back, you find something different. It appears that what we are seeing is not so much Pygmalion, but it's much more Frankenstein. Basically, the West started to create a replica of itself, and then suddenly the replica decided to destroy the creator. And from this point of view, our major argument is about the politics of imitation. Why the world without political alternatives ended up in a situation in which the imitation produced resentment, and this is our fourth story. Produced resentment in Central and Eastern Europe, where really we have been like the Monkey King. We wanted to be like the West. It was not about colonization. Nobody was imposing this on Central and Eastern Europe. It was our choice. The major idea of 1989 was the idea of normality. We want to be a normal country. We don't want to experiment. We want to be simply like the West. And then two things happened as a result of this revolution of normality. First, suddenly, future was not so much ahead in time, but it was next to you in space. Liberal revolution of 1989 is the first in history in which it was the winning party and not the losing party that left the country. After every revolution, somebody is leaving. After the Russian Revolution, it was the White Russians that have been expelled. After the French revolutions, basically the royalists left. Paradoxically, after 1989, in Central and Eastern Europe, the first people who left were the liberals after the success of the liberal revolution, because revolutionaries always wanted to live in the future, and if the future of Poland was Germany, why to wait for Poland to become like a Germany? Go to Germany, try to see how they live, to study. This was a new opportunity. So this was incredibly important story of this, because I do believe this is also something that was very much underestimated. And the second was this idea of normality. Let's be normal. But you know, the idea of normality has two different meanings. Normal is the normative, the ideal, but normal is also what is the most widespread. So from this point of view in Bulgaria, to be corrupt was not normal because it was not the norm, but it was also normal because it was the widespread. So strangely enough, basically people started to live with this schizophrenia of the totally different ideas of normality. And I'm saying this because as a result of it over time, in East European cases, it came politicians who came to power. And this is true for Mr. Orbán, this is true for Mr. Kaczynski, it's very different. Their major battle cry was, we do not want to imitate the West anymore. Because in a world which is divided between the imitated and the imitators, being an imitator, particularly in a world in which culturally it's so important to be original, created sense of inferiority. So these people didn't have, and this is one of our major arguments, they didn't have a well kind of developed ideology, but this idea of we're not going to imitate anymore, even more, you are going to imitate us now.
In Eastern Germany, which is of course a special case, there was this term came up after 1989, the Besserwissi, the Westerner who knows everything better and explains it all to us and who condescendingly looks down upon the East Germans. Is this a general phenomenon? Was it Western arrogance and a lack of sensitivity and understanding that contributed to this process that you describe?
Listen, the strange story of the book is that normally people who are unhappy with the development of 1989, they're going to say, oh, if we have done this policy here or arrogance here, I find it as a much more structural issue. There was no alternative. Basically, you have only one model which was worth imitating. But here imitation, and we're developing very much, working basically with the work with the French philosopher René Girard, who spent a lot of his life working on the problem of the mimesis and imitation. And the biggest problem is when you want to imitate somebody, and we're talking not simply about borrowing his techniques and so on. But if you want to be like somebody, three things are critically important. It means that you believe that he's better than you. By the very fact that you want to be like him, you already believe that he's better than you. Secondly, and this is why it was so important to have different cases, because we have the Russian case, American case, and Chinese case. When you are imitating somebody, you also want to replace him. This is a rivalry relations. I do believe this is the major thing that Fukuyama didn't get right, because Fukuyama was right. There was one model that was worth imitating. Now it is changing with China and so on, but it came 25 years later. But he believes that the world that is going to be populated by the replicas of the West, in a certain way, is going to be a not confrontational world. But the relations between the imitator and the imitated is a relations of rivalry. And I'm going to give you a story, which is, Girard basically is giving this example too. There was a famous Dostoevsky short story called The Eternal Husband. And this is a story of a man whose wife died. His wife used to have a lot of lovers. So when she died, he started to visit all his lovers and trying to understand why she had all these lovers. And he was particularly fascinated by one person, which for him was a kind of the model seducer. And he tries to imitate him and imitate him. All the story, by the way, is taken, the narration is from the point of view of this guy. And then he decided to marry another woman. And he invited this former lover of his wife for a dinner. And it was critically important because first he wanted to check, is this the woman that he has basically decided to marry, or worse? If he's tried to seduce her, but secondly, to show that this time he also knows the tricks. He can defend his possessions. I'm saying because this type of a rivalry based on imitation, I want to be like you, but I'm going to be also better than you. I'm saying this because from this point of view, Russian story is very different than Central and East European story. Listen, Russians were never wanted, unless for a very small, short period of time and very small group, never wanted to be like the West. For many reasons, it's a big country, different history. For them, in the beginning, imitation was simply the way to survive. But then, with the passing of time, they discovered imitation, but not imitation of the Western institutions, but what they perceived the imitation of Western policies and exposing Western hypocrisy as the major way to fight the West. So our second story is basically try to show how, particularly after 2008 and 2012, mirroring the West became imitating, but this time imitating with the idea to destroy, become a major strategy of the Russian leadership. For example, if you're going to read the famous declaration for the annexation of Crimea, you're going to see that whole passages have been taken from the Western declaration for the recognition of Kosovo's independence. Mm-hmm. All the language that have been used by the Russian government was a human rights language. And I do believe this is quite interesting to see how differently imitation works.
Yeah. Just want to go back for a second. You used before the term, which is quite controversial in some people, there is no alternative, TINA.
Yeah.
There was talk about, after 1989, of a third way, of an alternative to just adopting the West. Was this ever an option that could have been done under also different circumstances?
Don't believe, you know, Václav Klaus famously said that the third way leads to a third world. The story was that in 1989, and we have quite a lot of in the book, the dissidents were one of the most promoters of the idea of the normality. And the story was that there was probably for 6 months a moment that Central and Eastern Europe has something to teach the West. There was this talk, particularly coming from certain type of leftist West European intellectuals, but strangely enough, it was the Easterners who were saying, no, we don't want to teach anybody anything. We basically want to become a normal country. And this obsession of normality is critically important. And from this point of view, unification of Germany was very important. Listen, you remember that in Germany, there was a major debate to have a new constitution, to believe that unified Germany is a new state, or simply basically to have East Germany, because the basic law was allowing this, to reunite. And the major story was, let's reunite. Let's not invent new things. And this was done also on the level of international institutions. It was about NATO, it was about European Union, and so on. We can speculate how different it could be. We are not doing this in the book, because I do believe that structurally, both sides were ready for the world of imitation. East Europeans started to revolt against it 20 years later. Then in 1989, 1990, we were much more demanding to imitate. And this is also interesting in the discourse of the Western intellectuals. Go back to Habermas. He's talking about a catch-up revolution. Simply, basically, the Easterners should do what we did 50 years later. Go to Frey, who said, East European 1989 didn't produce a single new idea. This was basically exactly. So from this point of view, there was no real intellectual climate for this, and to be honest, then the alternative was not very clear. There was a general story, and here I want to make a point which was interesting, because we were doing in the book very much trying to explain why the idea of the end of history became so popular, not so much in the West, particularly the United States, but also in Eastern Europe, even in Russia. Why East Europeans were so much attracted by the end of history? Because paradoxically, it was touching the major assumptions of anybody who has been socialized in Marxism. For the ex-communist, it was easy to believe that the end of history is liberalism than to believe that there is no end. They should be a final destination. This teleological idea. Paradoxically, the Marxist style of thinking was the biggest ally of the West in 1989.
Now, things went quite well for about 20 years or 18 years. Now, you also mentioned the year 2008, which was the year of the world financial crisis, and there has been a lot of thinking about its effect on politics in the United States, the rise of Trump, in Britain on Brexit. Was the impact of this world financial crisis, which left a major, which also was really badly or strongly felt in East Central Europe, was the impact there maybe even worse?
It was different, because one of our major arguments is that you cannot explain the rise of the populist parties simply through economic explanations. For example, it can work for some countries, it's never going to work for Poland. Here there are several Polish colleagues. Poland never went into recession. Even if you see the Gini coefficient, in the last 10 years it was declining in Poland, so inequality was not rising up. It was something much more important. You are imitating a model, and suddenly the model went into crisis. And suddenly you start to believe that you're imitating the wrong thing, because the West itself started to be very doubtful about its own model. This is why we have a special chapter on the United States, because the interesting story about the United States for us was that why the imitated started to hate the world that imitates them. Why the American voters voted for President Trump, whose message was, the America is the biggest victim of the post-1989 world. And for us it was quite interesting to try to see this kind of a change. And it was very interesting to show to what extent also in the logic of the business, the imitator is also the worst competitor. Because he's taking all your competitive advantages and starting to use them against you. And this is also comes our China story, which none of us is a specialist on China, but we wanted to make one principal argument. China never was part of the age of imitation. China was borrowing, but they were always claiming that they're doing something of their own. Being like the West was never the agenda. Getting everything that they can get from the West, which they believe it works, was always there. They can steal, they can buy, they were doing in different stories. And from this point of view, if we compare Soviet Union and China, you're going to be shocked to see that in 1989, both leadership were convinced that the communist system does not work. But they have a totally different explanations what should be preserved and what should not. Basically, Gorbachev believed that what is good about the socialist society is the socialist idea, and what is bad is the Communist Party, which is basically paralyzing everything, so you should destroy the party in order to save the socialism. Chinese believe that what was good about communism was the Communist Party and its effective control. What basically they should change is the socialist ideas. So the very fact that China was doing so well at the moment in which everybody was saying that there was no alternative, suddenly also created a problem for the crisis. And this is why we believe that 2008 and the Chinese rise and all this created the situation, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, that it's not simply that we are imitators. We cannot be sure anymore that we're imitating something that works. And this created this feeling of betrayal, which was also very much instrumentalized by certain leaders. But what we try to do, and I know that there are going to be agreements and disagreements with this, it's very easy to explain the rise of the Populist Party simply with some leaders, with their politics, with their corruption, and so on. The interesting story is not why they're doing this. The problem is why the public was ready for this message. And from this point of view, this is why for us the imitation issue was so important. And this is why basically, yeah, this book is, so this is why also I don't talk about, I don't believe it's, probably I never believed that the book is, any book of mine is as pessimistic as you read it, for a very simple reason is that what liberalism lost is its hegemony. But liberalism traded its hegemony for pluralism and paid the price for this. Now it is back. So this is not that liberalism is dead. For example, what President Putin was saying, but this is also interesting for you to notice. Putin was using Fukuyama language when in an interview in Financial Times, he said that liberalism is now obsolete. It was an experiment that failed. Do you ring a bell, something about the experiment that failed? But the story is that ideology is not like a canned food, which basically have an expiry date, and after that you should not consume them. They're going to be there, but they're not going to be hegemonic world. We cannot expect that the world is going to be like us. We don't expect that basically people are simply waiting to become like the West. And for us, it's very important to know that this is a totally different situation in which we should try to think differently. Is it pessimistic? It depends how much you have liked what was before. And I do believe that just mourning what was before and how great it was, this is also creating a past that it was not there very much. It was good for some people, it was not good for others.
One of the themes that you describe is the detrimental, even disastrous effect of emigration on these countries and the population loss that was experienced in countries like Bulgaria or the Baltic states. I think 20 to 25% of the population declining is just enormous. And there's a lot of thinking about the fact, and also the young and the educated leave, so there's always a lot of talk about the brain drain and the economic, on the effect on the economy. But how has this also influenced the political life and the balance between the different forces in these countries?
Now listen, this is quite important. As you know, I have this kind of a sense that when we talk democracy these days, we should be much more careful also to try to understand the working of the demographic factor. People have been emigrating from Eastern Europe for centuries. But do you know where is the difference? They have been emigrating from the demographically growing societies. So now you have a combination of three things: aging population, declining population, and outmigration. If you go all over Europe, it's not Eastern Europe, and try to see which are the two factors which are most going to predict the vote for the far-right parties, this is the density of population and how much population was lost in the last 5 years. Living out of the big city in Central and Eastern Europe, in where mainly old people are living with each other, young people out there, either in the capitals or they go abroad, creates a sense of loss that cannot be explained simply in economic terms. Loneliness is a very important political factor. And of course, particularly when you talk about the small societies, which also have been haunted historically by the fear of disappearance, ethnic disappearance and others. So this is why in Central and Eastern Europe it was so difficult to have the idea of a collective success, even in the countries which economically are doing fine. Listen, look Estonia. Estonia is not simply doing good in terms of GDP, they managed to basically become very well integrated in the IT revolution. This is a country that is really doing fine, but there are 2 million people. And out of them, 15% out of the country. And then the fact is that how to have the idea of a collective success. And for me, this is important because, as you know, I always believe that if you want to understand the reaction of Central and Eastern Europe to the refugee crisis, don't talk migration. There are no migrants. There are no refugees in Central and Eastern Europe. Try to understand the impact of out-migration. And people don't know how to talk out migration because at the same time, this is the best that happened to us. Go on every opinion poll, and people are going to tell you what is the best thing that you gained after 1989, the possibility to travel freely and to work abroad. What is, if you're living in our countries now, what is the thing that you fear most? This is not so much foreigners coming, not that we're welcoming anybody to go, but it is the fear that you own a living. And this also creates a strange situation that people are not noticing. Do you know which is the European country which for the last 3 years got most foreign labor? Poland.
Poland. From Ukraine, isn't it?
Mostly Ukraine. Yeah. But not only. To be honest, they have 20,000 people from Pakistan. Okay. Why, I don't know, but it's this is the figure. Secondly, do you know which is the EU member states which has the most liberal migration law? Hungary. Because the interesting story is, this is a country that started now very much to suffer from labor shortage. And because of the out-migration, it's not simply that people are leaving, but as a result of it, the investors are not coming because there is nobody to hire. So in a certain way, you should open, but you don't want to open your political society. You want, basically, you're opening for labor migrants, but you're not ready to give them citizenship. You don't want to be one of you, because the level of ethnic homogeneity is very strong in our countries, and this is perceived as major value. So this is part of the stories that I'm trying to talk about. And this is on, in the case of Russia, there is something totally different happening. Demography is also a major issue in the Russian debate. Nobody is going to understand Putin's turn to Christianity and all these anti-gay campaigns, if you're not going to understand that behind it mostly is a demographic fear of a declining population, low birth rates, and also out-migration, 10 million people. By the way, do you know that Russia, after the United States, is the second biggest receiver of migrant labor? They have almost 10 million labor migrants coming from Central Asia. So this trying to understand, for example, I was very much interested, and particularly with this anti-gay campaign in Russia. This is quite interesting. Russian society is not a very conservative society. There are people here who basically know the place very well. This is not the Bible Belt. Neither in the sexual type of experiences, they have divorce rates which are much higher in Western Europe. The level of abortion, nevertheless, that it's better than in the Soviet period, is very high. So from this point of view, you're not imagining kind of a very religious society. But the fear of disappearance and this conspiracy theory that all these things like gay rights, women's rights, were used by the West simply to kill the Russian population, this is what basically is shaping the political imagination. And I do believe this is quite interesting because demographic fears also explain why the Republican Party went behind Trump. And the fear is that all these migrants coming, they're good as a labor, but they see in them the future voters of the Democratic Party.
Leaving East Central Europe was made even easier through accession to the European Union and the free movement of people within the EU and free movement of labor. Was this a mistake? Would it have been better for the development of these countries if they had not maybe joined the EU at this time in terms of the outward migration?
Listen, in this book we don't go as a counterfactuals because what do we know how it's going to develop? Because you're going probably not to have risk. Let's give you a story. There was a major wave of migration before the countries joined the EU. In a certain way, the very idea of the revolution of normality is that you're going to join. Of course, joining is making it easier also to come back. This is different the way you're migrating, but this freedom of movement was at the heart of 1989. You cannot have it. Basically, this was the wall was destroyed. So yes, you can probably have a small differences depending of if the UK have decided not to open immediately to the Bulgarian and Romanians and others, but this is not our questions, to be honest. Our question is, and this was what interests me very much, the day Obama was leaving the White House in the memoirs of Ben wrote, he asked his aides the following question. He said, what if we were wrong? Listen, it's very different than what we did wrong. He didn't say who did wrong. He didn't say what went wrong. This is not Hillary Clinton's title, what happened. This is if we were wrong is what we got wrong, the meaning of the post-Cold War period. This is about what if we didn't understand exactly what has been happening. And I do believe from this point of view, and we start the book very much there, that this is the right question. And this is the question that we try to answer in this book. This is about, could it be that because we have these certain expectations about what should happen, we were quite blind for the things that have been happening, and we start to see them now only when we look back, including also migration, movement of people. For example, we took the Kipling's The Light That Failed, because this is for two reasons, by the way. This is a book that has two versions. There is a happy end version, which is a shorter version, and he did it because his mother insisted that they should be optimistic. And so basically you can play my mother, his mother in this, our conversation. And there was a longer version which was less optimistic. But this was also kind of, my question is, why we didn't see it before? For example, the outmigration of people, the figures were there always. It's not something that we didn't know. Why we needed basically to see the vote for certain political leaders in Central and Eastern Europe, why we needed basically to listen to Putin in 2007, when in the Munich basically he said what he said. And as a result of it, for us, imitation, and we could be wrong. To be honest, the problem with the books like ours is that we decided to take one idea, and through this one idea, to give the general interpretations. This book has always kind of the shortage that the life is much more interesting and kind of, there are much more other things to be done, but we wanted to come with a coherent story. Because it's quite important to understand, for example, that even things that we see like why Russians meddled in the American elections. Because they imitated. The most important was, I want to do to you what I believe you're doing to me in order to show you that I'm as important as you are. Being a great power means that you should meddle. And from this point of view, this is a lot of book about political psychology. We, by definition, decided not to do much of economic analysis because first, none of us is very good at this. But secondly, this was one point that we wanted basically to press and to have a discussion about.
There are some examples of exceptions to the nationalist anti-liberal backlash. I mean, there are the Baltic states, which are generally actually seem to be, at least by my reading, more liberal parties or pro-European parties stronger. The recent presidential election in Slovakia, which was a pro-European backlash, when Romanian President Klaus Iohannis, also one of those. Now, are these just exceptions to the general trend, or could we perhaps also think that Orbán and Kaczynski could just be a certain phase, which could pass by?
No, for sure it can pass by, and this is one of our major arguments. We do not see that history simply turned from liberal to illiberal. What ended was the expectation of a liberal hegemony forever. And we're going to a normal political sphere in which parties and cycles are going to change. In the way people have been disappointed with some of the transition governments, they start to be disappointed with some of the populist government, the protest vote is changing, and this kind of an open future in which you basically first go much more contextual. I don't believe that in the next 10 or 15 years, these parties are going to dominate the political space. By the way, some of these parties also are kind of a last effort to stop certain type of developments that are there, because if you see longer sociological trends, for example, people talk about the rise of religious politics in Central and Eastern Europe, but at the end, go to the surveys and you're going to see the religiosity has declined in countries like Hungary and Poland compared to 1991, and particularly among the younger generation. So from this point of view, what we are telling is the end of a certain understanding of history that goes in one direction. This is the end of certain teleology. But this is not support for the idea that now it's going the other way. In a certain way, the funny story with the illiberals, and this is, to be honest, very true in the way Orbán talks history, he basically traded the end of history as the liberal period now as the end of history for illiberal period. So he basically believed that, again, history is on his side, but simply history goes in another direction. And our story is the future is much more the invasion of the unknown. Yeah. And democracy is not about strong structural trends that go for 50 years and nothing is going to change. It's going to depend on political choices, on political leadership, on everything that is kind of a normal politics. But of course, something in our view has ended. And this is the idea that basically we can be sure that on 10, 15, 20, 30 years, all others are going to be like us. And also we're not sure anymore who we are, because one of the major effects of all these developments is that basically suddenly people start fear. Could it be that we are much more, for example, like the Russians than we're ready to admit? What about basically Russia is an interesting country, by the way. They had a huge political transformation in which very few people got so much wealth, and this was done with a minimum violence. If you imagine how much wealth was transferred to a really very small group of people, and for Russian standards, it was quite peaceful. And the story is, could it be that basically we're seeing a similar period of concentration of wealth in our societies, and we are not seeing this? Russians have been voting on the elections, and as a result of it, basically people didn't have the feeling that they have been empowered. Could be our game. So from this point of view, we are really also trying to understand that. I want to finish on this, but in my view, the major illusion of 1989 was that the world is changing, but the West is going to become the same. Mm-hmm. What happened is that you understand that the world has been changed and the West has been changed too. And the Cold War West, in the way people knew it, have disappeared in the same way as the major enemy has disappeared. And this was one of the things of the book, and this was why, in a certain way, normally, you know that you're going to be totally transformed if you're defeated. What people didn't understand is the victory can transform you as much.
Many more questions, which I have, but also perhaps you. So I would like to give you a chance to ask a question. I think the microphones are getting ready. So who would like to have the... Are you ready? So please. Yeah. Yes. Just wait for the microphone, please. It's coming. Thank you.
Is it working? Okay. So basically, the populist parties, right-wing populist parties, are based on this nostalgia for the past, for the imaginary past, which is in America when America was great, in Great Britain when Britain didn't have those pesky Eastern Europeans coming. In Poland, it's a bit more difficult because we don't have this golden age, but still past is very important. But also liberal parties start to be looking to the past, to this past 5 years ago when we didn't have those populists ruling. So do you see any political force which looks actually to the future, or we are just past age of any kind of utopias?
This is a great question. By the way, there was a study being done in 2018, an opinion poll all over European Union, I mean all 28 countries, showing that 67% of the population believes that the world was better before. They're not going to agree when before, for different people. To the extent, I was talking to a very famous Bulgarian fiction writer, Georgi Gospodinov, who is now finishing a novel. And the novel is, imagine that European leaders are meeting, we cannot agree on the future, all their societies are so nostalgic about the past, so we should decide which is the year in which we want to go back. Mm-hmm. But we all should go in the same year. Mm-hmm. Because, listen, 1980 and 1981 probably was, 1981 was a good, I don't know was it or not for Austria, but I'm sure that for Poland this was not the best year with the martial law. So what is this common year? And here's the paradox. There is only one year in the 20th century in which we all can go back. And this was 1989. Because then the expectations for everybody was highest. Paradoxically, after everything that we have been talking about, the only common place where to go is because then we shared a common view of the future. So when you're asking which is the party, it's very difficult. And to be honest, I'll go also on this. Demography also plays a lot. You are not going to understand also, in my view, part of the major generational mobilization around the environmental issues and the climate change if you're not going to understand how small the cohort is of the young people. In places like Bulgaria, where also a lot of young people left, to be honest, electorally, the young people don't matter. This is why you're going to see them on the streets, because when they go to the ballot boxes, their votes does not make a difference. So from this point of view, you have a younger generation, which in order to get a political weight in a democratic politics, try to make a coalition with those who are not born yet. Mm-hmm. You start talking about the future generations, but you're talking about the future generation not in a positive key, but you're saying we want to be sure that they're going to be future generations. So you have a very strange idea of lack of future as a general definition of our idea of the political. You have two apocalyptic parties. On one level, you have the far right, who goes to people and said, your way of life is going to be destroyed. You're going to allow migrants and so on, and your way of life is done. Then comes the Greens, for whom I have a huge sympathy, honestly speaking, but they said, no, it's not your way of life. The life is going to be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And as a result of it, it's very difficult, your question about the future. And it was also very interesting because it was 1989, at least for Eastern Europe, that changed the idea of the future. The presence of the West was perceived as the future of the East. And suddenly for Eastern Europe, the future was not about time, it was about space. Mm-hmm. And now I do believe part of the crisis. The same in the United States, and of course, Stephen was very much contributing about this on American chapter much more than me, but there is one interesting story to try to understand also the American anxiety, kind of an immigrant society which started to fear migrants. There are two reasons for which you can fear the migrants. One is that they're not going to integrate. The other is that they're going to integrate very well. Mm-hmm. And it was the problem of the German Jews. They were destroyed not because they refused to integrate, but because they became more German than the Germans. And then, if this is the case, if everybody can become like me, who am I? And I do believe that also as a result of it, we're trying to give a slightly different twist of the idea of the identity politics in general. It's not simply that others does not like to become like you, but when they're becoming like you, the question, who am I, is becoming a difficult question.
Please.
Ivan, you said that this process of concentration of wealth was peaceful without violence. Really, it's true. It's true, but there is explanation for this because the ruling corporation was too strong and society was atomized. Civil society was very weak. There were no de facto democratic opposition. So really, they succeeded to do this quickly and relatively peacefully. But it doesn't mean that it's the end of the story. Because, now you see how in bigger cities in Russia there are different initiatives, political opposition initiatives, civil society is becoming more and more stronger. So certain alternatives exist. So don't you think that the process of concentration of this wealth really was peaceful? But don't you think that maybe the process of deconcentration of wealth in the, I think, near future will not be so peaceful and non-violent?
It's a great question. Unlike many people, because with Russia we went from one extreme to another. In 1990s, people were talking about Russia like a dead man walking. There was a total exaggeration of Russia's weakness, of Russia's dysfunctionality, and so on. Now we went to the other extreme. Russia is perceived as much more stable and powerful than it is. This is a model I cannot imagine how post-Putin Russia is going to look like. And one of the reasons is that Putin's elite are not allowed to think how post-Putin Russia is going to look like. Discussing this question is already perceived as disloyalty. But I'm going to say you what has changed. The liberal alternative in the way it exists in Russia today is not basically Russia becoming like the West. Being liberal in Russia does not mean anymore being totally pro-Western. In a certain way, Nemtsov was the last of this generation. They basically believe that they're different, that they have different initiative. There is a lot of resentment towards what Putin is doing. At the level of corruption in Russia, I'm Bulgarian, I can speak about corruption with a certain level of knowledge. Listen, Russians are in a group of their own. The scale is amazing. But this is a different world. In a certain way, I do believe Russia is going to change. I do believe that it can change in different directions. I'm not excluding a very explosive development, but it is not going to be returned to the 1990s at any story. The political actors are going to have totally different identity. And I do believe this is also for our book. This is why I don't believe that the story is to ask the question, is the world going to be more liberal or more illiberal in 20 years? It's a wrong question. It is basically to understand that the very nature of liberalism and illiberalism has changed. The joke here is that there was a vice president of the United States at the end of the Cold War who was not famous for his Dan Quayle. He was not famous for his intellectual power. And he was also making a gaffes when he was speaking. So once he wanted to say that the world is going to be better tomorrow. But he said, the future is going to be better tomorrow. Our book starts with a sentence, the future was better yesterday. And from this point of view, for us it's very important to understand that something has ended. It's not liberalism that ended. It's the liberal hegemony that ended. And if we're not going to stop mixing the two, we're going to make a major strategic mistakes. I mean also on the level of political actions, on the way of understanding and so on. So from this point of view, it's much more a book about interpretation and trying to understand what is ended, what is alive, what is dead, and so on. So this is why I was not so much taken by this optimism, pessimism story, because I do believe that defending the status quo in the way it was is wrong.
Is there any rival hegemony in sight, or have we entered a non-hegemonic world in terms of ideas?
So this is also part of our China. The very fact that we decided to write about China should show that coming from a small country, you have the right to be much more to be ready to exploit your ignorance easier than if you're coming from other places. But what basically we decided to show is that we are very much in agreement. The competition between the United States and China is going to shape the world that is coming. But it's not going to be the return of the Cold War. There is no universal ideological project coming from China. And this is why when we talk about imitation, about China, we made three things. First, China believes that it's so special and superior that nobody can imitate it. Secondly, they don't like the world which is populated with the replica of China. When everybody starts to behave like China, it's not good for China. Mm-hmm. So from this point of view, they're going to have economic and other instruments to dominate and basically to create a totally asymmetrical relationships. But it's totally different than Soviet Union, who really believes that the future of the world is basically countries that look like the Soviet Union. And it's very different than the United States. So we made the following comparison. How America knows the world? America knows the world through the melting pot, getting people from all over and making them Americans. America knows the world in the process of transforming others becoming Americans. How China knows the world? Through the Chinatown. Chinatown means that you're sitting at the middle of a foreign city, you're keeping your identity, you're trying to exploit basically the environment, you're not trying to change others, but you're not allowing others to change you. So from this point of view, the difference between the melting pot and the Chinatown, in my view, is very much going to give this kind of a different world in which we are coming.
But maybe there's another model. I mean, when you say small countries cannot be a model, I mean, there's a place like Singapore, which is combining economic success with authoritarian political system. Is this something countries are looking at and saying maybe we could be just even small and successful and extremely stable in that sense?
Listen, but let's also say this, that in a certain way Singapore, and it was incredible success, was successful in a certain also geopolitical context, which was not there. And they're interesting countries, and because Ivan and Spomenko in front of me, they're countries that are going to be most kind of, and places that are going to be most destabilized by this change. For example, Yugoslavia was a very interesting country, which was functioning very well in the context of the Cold War. But the problem is when the Cold War was there, the very rationale for the country has disappeared. Singapore was functioning incredibly well in the world in which US and China have been partnering. Okay, imagine the world in which the Americans and the Chinese are saying, there is a new war, the technological war, the 5G war. Which kind of technology you're going to adopt? And then I don't want to be the Singaporean government.
Any questions? Am I missing? No?
I can tell you a joke.
Okay, that's always a good way to...
And the joke, because the joke when there was no question. There is a very old Soviet joke. A guy staying in front of the headquarters of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and giving a leaflets. And he was immediately arrested. But then they look at the leaflets and they were totally empty. So they said, but why? You're spreading these empty leaflets. And the guy said, but everything is clear. So from this
Well, I really... Oh, you would like to raise your hand, please?
I'm not bringing up this question just because of the events of the last week, but because of this peculiar country, Ukraine, that's caught between the Russian vision and the Western European vision. And could you comment on Ukraine and where they would fit into this Frankenstein mold?
Listen, we have been in a certain way, let's put it like this, brave enough to have a chapter on China, but I'll never be brave enough to have a chapter on Ukraine. For a very simple reason, and this is true also for countries like Bulgaria. They're countries in which you should know everything in order to understand something. And Ukraine is one of them. I do believe that, of course, Ukraine was coming late in all this process. Basically, they entered the end of history when the history has already returned. Mm-hmm. And as a result of it, basically, you have this kind of also schizophrenia of discourses and others. I don't believe that basically Ukraine simply is going to be treated in the way Poland was treated in the 1990s and so on. So from this point of view, in geopolitical terms, in political terms, they're going to be a new identity for them. On the other side, I do believe that the nature of the Ukrainian state, very much based on the anti-Russian nationalism after Crimea, is also not going to disappear, nevertheless, who is basically elected or not elected. Here is one thing about Ukraine that I want to make a point, which I do believe is underestimated. We talk about out-migration. If there is a country which is going to be shaped more than anybody else but out-migration, this is Ukraine, for three reasons. East Europeans now really, we need migrants at high cost. And on the other side, culturally, we are much more closed than the West. The only people that we are really very happy to welcome is the Ukrainians, basically Moldovians, and so on. As a result of it, I do believe that the pace of out-migration, also combined with a very bad economic performance, is going to depopulate Ukraine, even in a bigger sense than it was done for some other countries. And Ukraine, you know, has a bad demographics like all of us. But here comes the story. This is going to change not simply economically, but also the nature of the electoral body. Because the people who are living in Ukraine politically are the people that you want them to stay. Mm-hmm. Younger, better educated, mainly from the Western Ukraine and so on. So basically, these are the voters for the parties that the West wants to win the elections. Just to give you one example, a small liberal party in Bulgaria, which is around, is winning 26% of the diaspora vote and 4.6% of the national vote of those who are living in the country. And Romania was very much an example of how the mobilization of the diaspora is changing politics. So I do believe in 5 or 10 years, the out-migrations can basically lead to a major also change of the geopolitical orientation because of the nature of the electoral body. Of course, it's also going to be very much related to the fact to what extent the Donbas voters are going to be allowed or not to vote on the elections. But otherwise, I don't believe that I have anything really interesting and insightful to say about Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine now is, and this is talking about imitation and the famous observation of Marx that things repeat, but first time as a tragedy, then as a farce. So you have the Russia intervention in the American politics in 2016, and now basically you have the farcical Ukrainian intervention in which the president went to Ukraine and asked to interfere. But it's going to be difficult because I do believe that at the end of the day this is going to destroy Joe Biden as a candidate of the Democratic Party.
There's a question, yes, back there.
Mr. Krastev, thank you for your speech. We now have a new European Commission, so I was wondering whether you could say or predict the next decade of within the European Union, where the West and the East are now supposedly somehow meddling with each other, and also so referring internally and externally in terms of foreign policy. How do you see the coming 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, okay, I'll try. Nevertheless, that you know this famous American basketball coach who said it's very difficult to predict, particularly the future.
Baseball.
But here's the story. I do believe that first, this European Commission, for a very clear political reason, is going to soften the talk about Hungary and Poland, and secondly, there's going to be a major distinction between Poland and Hungary. Poland is a very big country. This is one of the interesting stories that people don't understand. Size matters in European politics. And for Germany, basically, to try to isolate and exclude Poland is a major kind of economic and geopolitical threat. So from this point of view, if you're going to see is that there are going to be a major attempts to try to find a modus vivendi with Poland when it comes to major issue. And also you're going to see the Visegrad 4, this is one of my predictions, is not going to survive in the next 5 years. The last meeting which Mr. Orbán had basically in Budapest, it was the Slovak and the Czech Prime Minister, it was the Serbian President, there was no the Polish President there. So strangely enough, I do believe that Hungary will try to much more try to make a coalition also with some of the Balkan countries outside and even Ukraine. This is why for them the Commissioner for Enlargement and for Neighborhood is so important, because strangely enough, the relations between Poland and the Baltic states on the other side and the others are going to be very much kind of challenged. One, because of the geostrategic issues concerning Russia, Ukraine, but secondly also because of the size. East Europeans also, I don't believe, of course, we're going to produce noise, but this is an interesting noise because the nationalism of all these governments is a nationalism in the absence of national economies. When they talk about countries like Hungary and Poland, don't realize is that around, I hope I'm not wrong, but 30% of the industrial production of Hungary is produced by 4 German companies. So, paradoxically, the idea that you're simply getting out of the European Union and trying to go on an openly anti-European course is not on the menu for any of them. And then you have the Macron vision. And to be honest, Macron is not totally unhappy with East Europeans being very noisy and insisting on sovereignty, because his idea was, let's go back and to rediscuss. For him, it was not 1989, it was 1992. He believes that there should be much more consolidation of the core Europe, that there should be a Europe of different geographies. He recognized, by the way, the strategic importance of Poland, but he said, if the Visegrad countries, or if some of them wants to be part of an outer circle of European integration, this is their sovereign choice and we should not stop them. So the idea that you're going to have a much more integrated politically Western Europe, the core countries, and then you're going to have a much more periphery with some of East Europeans, of course, Bulgaria and Romania, and then even an outer kind of a circle with countries like the United Kingdom, but also he's thinking, in my view, what you're doing with Turkey and Russia. This is where, for example, the French vision is. The interesting story for Central and Eastern Europe was that we were so much focused on trying to assert our sovereignty fighting Brussels that we didn't understand that this is not the center of power anymore. For example, I was shocked to see some of the Central and East European government siding openly with Trump at the moment when he's saying that he's going to put the tariffs on the German cars. If he's going to put the tariffs on the German cars, the biggest losers are going to be Central and East Europeans. They're going to be the production in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic and others that are going to fail. If they're going to be closing of factories, they're not going to be closed in Germany. So the idea of a common economic interest, in my view, is going to come. But one thing that I do believe is going to change is that the talk about the rule of law is going to be there. But I don't believe that the West, and this is also the German experience with the East, don't forget, now the Germany discovered the East within itself. And many of the things that Germans basically are thinking about what worked and not with the East is going to form their policies towards Eastern Europe. I do believe it's going to be wrong because, strangely enough, East Germany is a much more extreme case than anybody else. But I do believe, at least in the German political thinking, this is going to be a very important moment because now with the rise of the AfD, and AfD is very particularly certain wing of the AfD is very much perceived as East German phenomena, not as a West German phenomena. It's going very much to shape the way they think about the East.
Well, even the hour has passed, which is the bad news. The good news is that if you want to know more, if you want to hear more from him, the book is coming out fairly soon, in October in English and in November also in German, The Light That Failed. So I encourage you to just wait for a few more weeks and then get the book and find everything out that can be said about all these themes and things that you want to know. I would like to thank you very much for this really interesting conversation and want to thank you for your interest.
Thank you very much.